The smell came before the sun did. That was the first thing Sera Fontenot learned to recognize about a Louisiana morning gone wrong. Not the light, not the bird song, not the low mist lifting off the Atchafalaya, but that smell, thick and sweet and rotting all at once like sugar cane, left too long in standing water, like something that had once been alive and was now becoming something else entirely, something that had no good name yet. She was 17. She had been waking up to that smell for 7 years. If you have ever stood on land your family worked for 3 generations and felt it slipping, not all at once, not with any drama, but slowly, the way a good shoe wears through at the sole, then stay with this story. Subscribe if you believe that patience is not the same as surrender. And before we go any further, leave a comment and tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight and what the land means to the people who raised you. The Fontenot place sat on the soft western edge of the Atchafalaya Basin, where Louisiana stops pretending to be solid and admits what it has always been: water with ambitions. 65 acres of low, dark earth, stitched through with drainage ditches and old fence lines, and the particular silences that belong only to places where herons still outnumber people. Sera's great-grandfather had broken this ground with a mule and a borrowed plough in 1931. Her grandfather Lucien had farmed it for 43 years and liked to say that bottom land near a river basin was so alive you didn't grow things in it so much as introduce them and step back. Her father Auguste had inherited both the land and the belief, and for 30 years that belief had held. Then Pelican Cane Processing expanded their facility 3 miles east, and the trucks started coming. Not with any announcement, not with any letter that said plainly, "We are going to poison the corner of your property that your grandfather called the best ground he ever turned." It came the way most damage comes to people who cannot afford lawyers, quietly, incrementally, with just enough paperwork to suggest that someone somewhere had thought about it. The representative from Pelican, a man named Ward Stelly, who wore pressed shirts and carried a clipboard like a shield, arrived one October morning when Sera was 10 years old. He stood on the porch and used the word byproduct the way other men use the word weather, as something that happens to people, not something that anyone is responsible for. He said temporary 4 times. He said operational necessity twice. He said we appreciate your patience at the end, which Sera would later understand was the politest possible way of saying that her family's patience was not something being requested. It was something being assumed. The trucks came that November, 1 at first, then 2, then a quiet convoy that arrived before dawn on Tuesdays and Thursdays and reversed toward the low corner of the south field, the corner her grandfather had called the good bottom, and opened their tailgates like tired mouths and left behind black mountains of crushed cane fiber and mill sludge that steamed in the cool morning air. By the time Sera was 12, the grass near the fence line had turned the color of weak tea. By 13, the sweet corn in the south quarter was growing thin and yellow stalks that snapped in August wind that should have found them strong. By 14, her mother had quietly stopped drinking from the kitchen tap without saying why, and had started buying water in plastic jugs that lined the back porch like silent witnesses. Her father had written letters, 11 of them by Sera's count, each one more carefully worded than the last. Each one answered when answered at all with language so smooth and circular it left no handhold. He had driven to the Pelican offices in Lafayette twice. The first time he came home angry, talking fast, gesturing with his hands, the way he did when something in him was still fighting. The second time he came home quiet. He sat at the kitchen table for a long time without eating and looked at his hands as though he was reading something written there that he didn't entirely understand. He didn't go a third time. The neighbors were not much help. Some of them worked at the refinery and were not in a position to have opinions. Some of them simply did not want trouble to find their mailboxes. Clovis Thibodeau, who farmed the 30 acres across the gravel road and had known Auguste since they were boys, throwing crawfish at each other in the ditch behind St. Clement's School, said over the fence one evening, "Auguste, that's a company with lawyers and a mailing address and a phone number that goes to a person paid to do nothing but wait for people like us to run out of money." He didn't say it unkindly. He said it the way men say things they wish weren't true. Then he went inside and the light in his kitchen came on and the conversation was over. It was Sera's mother Delphine who carried the weight of it most quietly. She worked checkout at the Piggly Wiggly in Brobridge 3 days a week, came home smelling of the refrigerated air from the produce section, and made dinner without complaint, and asked about homework, and did not talk about the trucks or the smell or the letter from the bank that had arrived in a window envelope the previous spring and which now lived in the junk drawer under the take-out menus, though no one had put it there by accident. The bank letter said, in the careful language of people who foreclose on things for a living, that the Fontenauds were behind on a note secured by 28 acres of the South Field, and that if the situation was not resolved within 90 days, the bank would be required to exercise its options under the terms of the original agreement. Exercise its options, as though the land were a horse that needed running. Sera had read the letter in the junk drawer one afternoon while looking for a pen. She had read it twice, folded it exactly as it had been, and put it back under the take-out menu from China Walk that hadn't been opened since 2019. Then she had gone out to the porch and stood looking at the South Field for a while. And then she had gone inside and done her homework and not said anything to anyone. That was March. This is the morning after the morning everything changed. The day Auguste Fontenot fell was a Tuesday in late April, warm enough that the kitchen windows were open and the smell from the South Field drifted through the screens like something that had learned it didn't need an invitation. He was standing at the stove. He was making coffee the way he always made it, too strong in a percolator, older than Sera, with the particular focused attention he gave to small things ever since the large things had stopped feeling manageable. Sera was at the table with her backpack, eating a piece of toast. Delphine had already left for the early shift. He didn't make a sound when he went down. That was the thing Sera came back to later, that there was no warning sound, no cry, just the sudden absence of the ordinary noise of the kitchen, the silence where the percolator sound had been, and then the sound of him on the floor. She was around the table before she knew she was moving. He was conscious. His color was wrong gray-pale beneath the permanent tan, like someone had turned a dimmer switch. He was breathing, but the breathing was effortful, deliberate, the breathing of a man who is paying attention to a thing that is usually automatic. "I'm all right," he said, which was the most obviously untrue thing he had ever said to her, and that included the time he told her the crawfish in the trap were just sleeping. The ambulance took 22 minutes. Sera spent them on the floor beside him, her hand on his arm, talking to him about nothing, about the weather, about a documentary she'd half watched the night before, about the way the herons had been flying low all week, which her grandfather used to say meant rain. She talked to keep him present and to keep herself from thinking about the window envelope in the junk drawer. At the hospital in Lafayette, a cardiologist named Dr. Préjean, who had the quiet manner of someone who had delivered difficult news so many times that it had become a kind of kindness, told Delphine and Sera in a small consultation room with a fern in the corner that August had experienced what they called a significant cardiac event, that his heart had been under sustained stress, likely for years, and that he would need a procedure, a repair of a valve that had been quietly failing, that would cost in the neighborhood of $40,000 after the limits of their insurance had been applied. Delphine sat very still. Sera looked at the fern. "We'll figure something out," Delphine said, in the voice she used for things that she had not yet figured out. Dr. Préjean nodded gently and gave them some papers. Sera sat in the plastic chair in the hospital corridor for a long time after that. She could hear distantly the ordinary sounds of a busy hospital, the PA system, the rubber wheels of carts, someone laughing somewhere in a way that seemed impossible. She thought about $40,000. She thought about the 28 acres and the 90-day letter that was now more than a month old. She thought about the trucks that came on Tuesdays and Thursdays and had never once looked at the house. She thought about her mother saying, "We'll figure something out," and she thought about how for 7 years figuring something out had meant writing letters and driving to Lafayette and coming home quiet. She thought about what it would mean to lose the South Field, and then the North Field to pay for the South Field, and then nothing, and her father's percolator in a moving truck and strangers' corn growing in the good bottom. She sat there until visiting hours started, and then she went in to see her father, and she held his hand, and she did not cry because she was saving that for later. She never actually used it. Sera went back to school on Thursday because there was no reason not to. August was stable. Delphine had a plan that involved her sister in Baton Rouge and a phone call to a financial advisor whose name she'd found on a community board, which was the kind of plan that felt like action without being action. But Sera understood it was what her mother needed to do with her hands right now, and she did not say that. After school, instead of taking the bus, she walked. It was 4 miles. She didn't mind. She needed the time inside her own head, which was something she could not explain to anyone, so she didn't try. She came home through the back field, which she did sometimes to avoid the kitchen, where the percolator still sat on the stove, and she wasn't ready to look at it yet. She came through the stand of live oaks at the property's edge, following the old fence line where the wire had rusted to the color of autumn, and the posts leaned at angles that suggested decades of patient negotiation with the wind. The south field opened before her, and beyond it, in the low corner, the good bottom, the ground her grandfather had said you could push a fence post into by hand, the Pelican Waste Mountain sat in its usual silence. Lower now than it once had been in the older sections, years of rain had settled it, spread it, flattened the peaks, and filled the gullies. The newer dumps were fresher, darker steam rising off them on cool mornings. But the old section, the ground they had started on 7 years ago, had weathered into something almost unrecognizable. Sera stood at the fence and looked because she had nothing better to do, because looking cost nothing, because after 2 days of fluorescent hospital light and the smell of antiseptic, even this broken corner of the farm felt like something real. That was when she saw it. Not the pile, not the black mountain. Something at the far edge of the oldest section, where the waste had flattened years ago, and the fence wire dipped close to the ground. A plant. A volunteer not planted, not cultivated, not invited, that had grown up through a curl of decomposing bagasse, with the quiet confidence of something that had never been told it wasn't supposed to be there. A tomato plant, not a small one, not the struggling yellow-leafed kind she'd tried to grow in the garden bed near the house. Dark green leaves, thick-stemmed, heavy with fruit, 5, 6, 7 tomatoes, visible from where she stood, each one larger than anything in her mother's garden, the stems bowing slightly under the weight. Around it, nothing grew. The surrounding soil was bare, pale, crusted, dead-looking. Just the one plant, arrogant in its abundance, rooted in the worst ground on the farm. Sera stood at the fence for a long time. The sun moved. She didn't. She thought about what her grandfather had said about this corner, about soil so alive you could push a post in by hand. She thought about what she could see, the bare ground, the dead drainage, the black pile still steaming at the far end. And then she thought about the one thing that didn't fit the picture. She climbed the fence. She didn't go near the fresh piles she'd learned years ago that the active dumps gave off gases that made her eyes water and her throat tighten. But she walked to the edge of the old section, the settled years-old waste, and crouched down beside the tomato plant and looked at it the way she might look at something that was trying to tell her something in a language she almost knew. The soil immediately around the roots was different, darker, looser. She pressed a finger into it, and it yielded not the hard acid-caked surface of the surrounding ground, but something that had give to it, something that crumbled slightly, something that smelled. And this was the part that stopped her breath for a moment. Something that smelled like the woods behind the barn after rain. Not like the dump. Like the woods, she sat back on her heels and looked at the plant, and looked at the ground, and looked at the plant again. Then she stood up, climbed back over the fence, and walked the rest of the way to the house without stopping. She did not tell anyone what she had seen, not that night, not the next morning. But she lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling, and for the first time in months, in years, if she was honest, she felt something moving in her chest that was not dread. It was something smaller and older and more stubborn than dread. She felt curious. The Brobridge Parish Library had a Tuesday afternoon quiet that Sera had always liked, the specific hush of a place where no one is pretending to be busy, where reading is still considered a sufficient reason to be somewhere. Mrs. Arsenault, who had been the head librarian since roughly the Eisenhower administration and had the card catalog memory to prove it, looked up when Sera came in and said, "You haven't been in since February." "I know. I'm sorry." "Don't apologize to a library. Ask it something." Sera asked for anything on composting. Mrs. Arsenault brought 3 books from the agricultural shelf. A university extension manual from LSU, a slim practical guide from the 1980s with a cover photo of a man looking proud beside a pile of dirt, and a thicker volume on soil biology that still had its original checkout card tucked in the back pocket, last borrowed in 1997, Then she went into the back room and came out with a handful of extension service pamphlets she'd rescued from the recycling bin from the agricultural college up in Baton Rouge. Someone was throwing these away, she said, as though that alone explained her saving them. Sera sat at the corner table by the window, the one with the low afternoon light and the view of the parking lot and the old pecan tree beyond it, and she read until the library closed. She came back the following Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that. What she learned slowly, in the way that real things are learned with confusion, first then the first thin edge of understanding, then something that widened, was that the Black Mountain on her family's land was not what anyone had called it. Not garbage, not waste, not a problem to be managed, or a liability to be dumped and forgotten. It was a beginning that didn't know it was a beginning. Sugarcane bagasse, the crushed dry fiber that remained after the juice was pressed out, was one of the most carbon-rich agricultural residues known to soil science. Dumped raw, it did what she had seen it do: acidified, smothered, leached the nitrogen from the soil it touched, resisted breakdown, choked roots and drainage, and anything that tried to grow through it. That was the version she had lived. That was the version 7 years of Tuesday truck runs had produced. But raw was not finished, and the difference between raw and finished her books kept returning to was not magic and not mystery. It was biology. It was life, billions of invisible organisms, bacteria and fungi, and the particular class of microorganisms her library book called actinomycetes, which were the ones responsible for that forest floor smell after rain, the deep, honest smell she had noticed around the tomato plant's roots. Those organisms needed carbon, and the bagasse had carbon in enormous abundance. But they also needed nitrogen, balance, air, moisture, the right conditions sustained over time. Give them those things and they would do the rest. They would eat the bagasse. They would breathe and divide and die and be eaten in turn, and in their dying would leave behind something that had a different name: humus. Stable, crumbling, dark, sweet-smelling organic matter that held water and released nutrients slowly and fed the microorganisms of the next generation and built soil the way a coral reef builds itself, one invisible layer at a time over time, without drama. The carbon-to-nitrogen ratio. That was the number her books kept returning to. The magic number, the balance point where decomposition happened efficiently and completely, was somewhere around 30-1. 30 parts carbon for every 1 part nitrogen. And raw sugarcane bagasse, she read, ran closer to 150-1, which was not a compost pile, which was a pile of carbon waiting without anyone to call. The nitrogen could come from many places: green plant material, manure, the thick protein-rich residues of almost any living thing. The bayou, she thought, the chicken coop, the grass clippings she usually burned in fall. She read about thermophilic bacteria organisms that worked best above 130 degrees Fahrenheit, generating their own heat as they worked, killing weed seeds and pathogens in the process. She read about turning the physical act of moving the cooler outside of a pile into the hot center, aerating it, giving the organisms oxygen. She read about the difference between aerobic composting, which smelled like earth, and anaerobic rot, which smelled like a disaster. She read about the way you could test a pile's moisture. With your hand squeeze a handful, and if one drop fell, you had it right. And one evening, sitting at the kitchen table with her library books while her father slept in the next room and the percolator sat cold on the stove, she stopped reading and sat very still with a thought that had been forming for weeks, finally completing itself. Pelican Cane Processing had been dumping raw material on her family's land for 7 years. They had been doing it because it was convenient, because no one had stopped them, because they thought about it the way men like Ward Stelly think about anything that's already solved as a solved problem, a line item, a Tuesday and Thursday task. They had called it waste, because that was the word for things you no longer needed, and they had not needed it, and so that was what it was. But waste was only a name. Underneath that name was chemistry. Underneath the chemistry was biology. Underneath the biology was something her grandfather had understood about this corner of the Atchafalaya without ever opening a textbook. The ground here did not forget what it knew how to do. She closed the book and sat for a while in the kitchen light. She started in the first week of May in the narrow strip of ground behind the old equipment shed, which was far enough from the road that no one passing would see what she was doing, and close enough to the fence line that she could wheel materials across in a reasonable amount of time. The shed itself was falling into a gentle disrepair that her father had always meant to address, and never had roof good siding, weathered to silver floor of packed earth that smelled of motor oil and old wood and time. She had claimed the south wall of it years ago for her own purposes, without asking permission and without anyone objecting. She built the first pile the way the LSU extension pamphlet described, a base layer of coarse sticks for airflow. Then bagasse from the old section of the dump loaded into the wheelbarrow, one heavy load at a time, not the fresh black piles, but the settled older material already softened by years of rain, already beginning in places to show the dark color of partially broken down fiber. Layer of bagasse, then a thin, careful layer of fresh chicken manure from the 6 hens her mother kept behind the garden, a small shovelful of soil from the woods behind the barn, the dark root-threaded soil under the live oaks which her book said would be alive with native microorganisms already adapted to this specific corner of Louisiana. Another layer of bagasse, another layer of manure thinner, this time. Water from the hose she'd run from the spigot on the shed's east wall until she squeezed a handful of the mixture and felt one drop form and fall from her fist. She owned a soil thermometer, a long steel probe with a dial face that she had ordered online with birthday money, a purchase she had made without explaining to anyone, which was fine because no one had asked. She pushed it into the center of the pile on the evening she finished building it, left it for 2 minutes, and pulled it out. 54 degrees, cold, ambient. Exactly the temperature of the surrounding air, which meant nothing was happening yet. She covered the pile with an old piece of burlap from the shed and went inside. The next morning she checked again. 57. The morning after 59. The morning she walked into the agricultural classroom at St. Madeleine High School and found herself looking at the spine of a book she had not seen before she almost didn't stop. It was on the corner of Mr. Emmett Burrus's desk, where Mr. Burrus kept his personal things, a coffee mug with a hairline crack, a photograph of what she assumed was his family, a small brass compass she had always been curious about and never asked about. The book was old, its spine cracked, held together along the bottom edge with a strip of clear tape that had yellowed. An Agricultural Testament, Sir Albert Howard, published 1940. She stopped in front of the desk. She didn't touch it. Mr. Burras was at the whiteboard, writing the week's soil chemistry vocabulary. He was 64 years old, grey-bearded, in the way of men who had stopped caring about their beard somewhere around 50. He had grown up on a dairy farm 2 parishes over, had taught agricultural science at St. Madeleine for 21 years, and had the particular quiet authority of someone who knew things in his body, not just in his mind. He noticed her looking. "Howard," she said, "you know it. I've seen it referenced. I haven't read it." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully read, recognition maybe, or something more complicated than recognition. He picked the book up and held it a moment, then set it back down. "Where are you reading that would reference Howard?" She paused. She hadn't told anyone, not her parents, not her friends. The one close friend she had, Amélie Broussard, who would have listened without judgment, but whose judgment Sera wasn't ready to risk. She hadn't told anyone because she wasn't sure yet that there was anything to tell. A pile of bagasse behind the equipment shed, a thermometer reading that had risen 3 degrees over 2 days. A theory. "Library," she said. "I've been reading about composting." Something moved in Emmett Burras's face. A careful movement, like a man who has learned not to react quickly to certain things. "What kind of material are you working with?" She told him. Not everything, not about her father in the hospital, not about the bank letter in the junk drawer, not about any of it. Just the material, the bagasse, the old section of the Pelican dump, the carbon to nitrogen problem, the tomato plant she had found growing in what should have been dead ground. He listened without interrupting, which was something she had not experienced from an adult in some time. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he went to the bookshelf along the back wall of the classroom, the shelf that held the texts he used in class and several that he clearly didn't, and pulled out a battered manila folder held together with a rubber band that had seen better decades. He set it on the desk in front of her. She looked at it. She looked at him. "What is this, sir?" "Something you should probably read before you go any further." She opened it. Inside were photocopied documents, legal filings, letters on official letterhead, a transcript of a meeting that she recognized from the header as having taken place at the Iberia Parish Municipal Building. And a name repeated on several pages as the petitioner in a complaint against Pelican Cane Processing, LLC, dated 2003. Emmett J. Burras. She looked up. His expression had not changed. It was the face of a man who has decided to be honest about something and is waiting to see what happens next. "You sued them," she said. "I tried." "What happened?" He looked out the classroom window, at the parking lot, at the pecan tree, beyond it, at something further still. "I did everything right," he said. "I had documentation. I had a lawyer who believed me. I had neighbors who said they'd testify." A pause. 2 of the neighbors backed out before the hearing. The lawyer settled for an amount that didn't cover his own fees, and Pelican had a team of people whose only job was to make the process last long enough that people like me ran out of patience or money or both. So they won. They waited. He turned back from the window. "There's a difference. It took me a long time to understand that." He looked at the folder in her hands. "What I'm telling you is, don't do what I did." She looked at him. She wasn't sure if that was a warning or an invitation or something in between. The bell rang. She put the folder back on his desk and picked up her bag. At the door, she stopped. "Mr. Buras?" "Yep." "The book. Can I borrow it?" He picked up an agricultural testament from the corner of his desk and held it out without ceremony. "Read it twice," he said. "First time you'll think it's about farming. Second time you'll understand what it's actually about." She took it. She read the first page standing in the hallway between classes and then put it carefully in the front pocket of her backpack where nothing could damage the spine. That evening she checked the thermometer. The dial had moved while she wasn't watching. 79 degrees. She stood with the probe in her hand in the fading April light and felt the number settle into her like a sound she'd been waiting to hear. Not warm enough yet, not the 130 degrees the books described as thermophilic territory, not the living, working heat of a pile in full biological motion, but moving, distinctly, measurably, undeniably moving in the right direction. She pulled the probe free and wiped it on her jeans and stood looking at the pile for a long moment. Behind her, the south field. Beyond that, the good bottom. Beyond that, the Pelican Waste Mountain, still steaming at its edges in the cooling evening. She put the thermometer back in her pocket. She had work to do. The pile hit 103 degrees on a Thursday morning, and Sera stood in the early light with the thermometer in her hand and felt something she hadn't expected. Doubt. Not about the science. The science was holding. The numbers were moving exactly the way the books said they should move, the thermophilic bacteria finding their footing, the pile generating its own heat from the inside out, the carbon beginning its long conversation with the nitrogen she had layered in. All of that was working. What she doubted, standing there in the damp May air, with the smell of the bayou coming in low over the equipment shed roof, was whether working was enough. $40,000, 28 acres, a bank letter that was now 8 weeks old and getting older, a father who came home from the short-stay rehabilitation unit, walking carefully as though the ground might have opinions about his weight. 103 degrees in a compost pile behind a shed that no one knew existed. She pushed the thermometer back into the pile's center, wiped her hand on her jeans, and went inside to make coffee in the percolator her father could not yet lift. The second pile went up the following weekend. Then a third 10 days after that. She was learning things the books had mentioned, but not fully prepared her for the physical reality of the work, which was different from reading about the work. The way swimming in the Atchafalaya was different from reading about currents. The bagasse was heavier than it looked, saturated from rain, and the wheelbarrow had a slow leak in its left tire that meant loading it 2/3 full and making more trips. Her shoulders learned new aches. The skin on her palms, which had been soft in the way of someone who did farm chores but not farm labor, began to harden along the grip lines. She developed a system. Mondays and Wednesdays she hauled material from the old section of the Pelican dump, selecting from the most weathered corners, the spots where years of rain had already begun the breakdown she was trying to accelerate. Tuesdays and Thursdays she turned the active pile's pitchfork work, lifting the cooled outer layers into the hot center, releasing the steam that rose from a working pile like breath on a cold morning. Fridays she checked moisture and temperature and wrote the numbers in a spiral notebook she kept on the shed's window ledge, the pages slowly warping with humidity. The notebook was not a plan. It was a conversation, She noticed things she had not expected to notice. The second pile ran hotter than the first. She had adjusted the carbon-to-nitrogen ratio after rereading the extension pamphlet, adding more manure, more of the nitrogen-rich duckweed she skimmed from the drainage ditch at the field's edge. It hit 141 degrees in its second week, and when she pushed her palm near the surface, not touching, just close, she could feel the heat radiating out like a living thing. She stood there longer than was necessary, hand extended toward the pile, and felt something shift in her understanding of what she was actually doing. She was not making fertilizer. She was making conditions. The fertilizer was being made by things she couldn't see, by organisms that had been in that soil and that duckweed and that chicken manure for centuries before either she or the Pelican Company existed. She was just giving them what they needed: temperature, air, moisture, time. The same things that everything alive had always needed, which were perhaps not as complicated as people made them sound. She wrote that in the notebook too, though she wasn't sure yet what to do with it. The trouble came in June, as trouble often does on a warm afternoon when everything feels like it should be easy. She had gone to turn the second pile and found it wrong before she got close. The smell reached her first, not the mineral earthiness of good active compost, not the forest floor richness she had been learning to associate with progress, but something low and sulphurous, the particular wrongness of a system that had tipped from aerobic to anaerobic. Drowning, the books called it. Too much moisture, not enough air, the wrong organisms taking over in the absence of oxygen and producing the smell of rot instead of the smell of life. A week of heavy June rain. She had forgotten or not thought through the way the tarp she'd used for covering had pooled water along its center crease and let it run off the edge and directly into the pile's middle layer. She turned the whole pile, all of it, an hour of hard work in the afternoon heat, sweat dripping off her chin onto the pitchfork handle, her arms burning by the third quarter. The material that came up from the center was dark and matted and smelled like something that had given up. She spread it out to breathe, added a thick layer of dry bagasse from the shed, where she'd been storing some against weather, forked it through until the texture changed from clumped to loose. She drank water from the hose. She looked at the pile. This is recoverable, she told herself, because her books had said so. A drowned pile was not a dead pile. It was a pile that needed to breathe. She fixed the tarp with 3 wooden stakes she found in the shed, angling it so rain would sheet off the sides instead of pooling in the middle. She checked the other piles. They were fine. The first pile was actually cooling, which her book said was a sign that it was moving through its thermophilic phase and approaching the quieter, slower curing stage. She pressed her palm to its surface. Still warm, but gentle now, like the back of a hand held to a forehead, checking for fever, the fever broken. She pulled the thermometer from her pocket and pushed it in. 94 degrees, dropping. She stood there with the probe in the pile and felt 2 things at once: the satisfaction of the number which was correct and expected, and the weight of everything it was not yet. 94 degrees in a pile the size of a hay bale, 28 acres, $40,000, a father moving carefully through rooms. She pulled the thermometer free. She wiped it. She put it back in her pocket. She went back to the drowned pile and turned it again, because the first turn had been structural, and the second turn needed to be thorough, needed to lift the bottom material that hadn't aired yet, and her shoulders had opinions about this that she ignored. Clovis Thibodeau saw her on a Saturday. She had been aware for some time that he could see the equipment shed from his kitchen window, had been aware of it in a low background way, the way you're aware of a thing you've decided not to think about. He was 70 years old and lived alone since his wife passed 6 years ago, and had the habits of a man who has made a life out of noticing things from a comfortable distance. She was crossing the yard with the wheelbarrow, which was loaded past its comfortable capacity, because she had misjudged the weight of wet bagasse again, and she was managing it with the particular focused stubbornness of someone who has decided they are not going to make a second trip. She heard the screen door of his house open and close, but did not look up, because looking up would have acknowledged the situation. "That's my wheelbarrow." She stopped. She looked up. He was standing at his fence line, 20 feet away, in the grey work pants and the green shirt he seemed to wear every day in some variation. He was looking at the wheelbarrow. "I know," she said. "Daddy borrowed it years ago. I can bring it back if you need it." "I didn't say I needed it." He looked at the wheelbarrow for another moment. Then he looked at the equipment shed. Then he looked at her. "What are you doing back there?" She considered. She had spent weeks not answering this question from people who hadn't actually asked it. Having it asked directly felt different. "Composting," she said. "The waste material from the pelican dump. I'm trying to convert it into something the soil can use." Clovis looked at the south field, looked at the dump, looked at her piles, which were not visible from where he stood, but whose existence the shed now broadcast in an olfactory way she had grown used to, and others had not. "Smells," he said. "The second pile had a moisture problem. It's recovered." He was quiet for a moment. Something worked in his face. Not skepticism exactly, something more private than that. "Your grandfather used to do something like that," he said finally. "Lucien, he had a pile going behind the barn every fall. Nothing fancy, but he turned it. He was particular about the turning." She had not known that. Her father had never mentioned it. Her grandfather had died when she was 6, and her memories of him were of warmth and hands and the specific smell of his work coat, not of agricultural methods. "He ever say why?" she asked. He said, "Clovis, every good thing takes its time, and you cannot bully it." The old man said it flatly, in the voice of someone quoting exactly. Then he looked back at the shed. "You need more nitrogen material, you can have the grass clippings from my back field. I don't do anything with them." He went back inside before she could respond, which was either extremely generous or an escape from having to hear her say thank you, and she suspected the latter. She stood for a moment looking at his closed screen door. Then she pushed the wheelbarrow to the shed. August was home by the second week of June, walking carefully as she had expected, but beginning to reclaim his kitchen the way a man reclaims something that has been held for him with deliberateness, with the particular attention of someone who has been reminded that ordinary things are not guaranteed. He made coffee again. He walked the yard in the morning slowly, with the doctor's instructions in mind and his own inclinations working against them. He had not asked her about the equipment shed. She was not certain whether he hadn't noticed or had noticed, and was waiting or had noticed, and had decided that some things were a daughter's business until they weren't. With Auguste Fontenot, these three possibilities were genuinely indistinguishable. Delphine had taken a second shift at the Piggly Wiggly Friday evenings. She came home smelling of produce and exhaustion, and asked about August and about homework and about nothing specific, which was the way Delphine asked about everything specific. Sera answered in the same register. They were both of them women who said what was necessary and trusted the rest to be understood. The financial situation had clarified from impossible to merely very bad, which was a kind of progress. Delphine's sister in Baton Rouge had lent enough to cover the first round of surgical prepayments. August's procedure was scheduled for late August. The bank had agreed to a 60-day extension on the note, which meant they had until mid-September before the question of the Southfield became something other than theoretical. Mid-September was 11 weeks away. Sera turned her piles on schedule and added Clovis's grass clippings in thick alternating layers, and checked her temperatures every morning before school, and wrote the numbers in the notebook with growing attention to what they told her. The third pile had come up fast hotter than the others, running at a consistent 147 degrees through its second and third weeks, steam rising off it on the cooler mornings like something breathing. Emmett Burras had come by on a Saturday in late June, not announced, not asked. He had simply appeared in the driveway in his truck, gotten out, looked at the shed and said, "You want to show me?" She had shown him. He had walked the row of piles without speaking, crouching at each one, pressing his hand near the surface. Pulling the thermometer from her, she had handed it to him without thinking. The way you hand someone a tool they know how to use, and taking readings. He had looked at the notebook. He had looked at the material she had in reserve in the shed, the bagasse she'd been grading by age and texture, the buckets of duckweed, the stored grass clippings. He didn't compliment her. She had expected this because Emmett Burras was not the kind of man who complimented things that were simply going correctly, and in this she recognized a form of respect. What he did was ask questions. "What's your turning interval on the first pile?" 5 days. "I'm trying to move it to 7 now that it's past peak temperature." "What are you seeing in the texture? The core is starting to look different, darker. The fiber structure is breaking down. You can still see the bagasse, but it's losing its form. Smell. Earthier, less like manure, starting to smell like the woods." He handed the thermometer back. "Extend the turning interval on the first pile to 10 days. It doesn't need the aeration at this stage, it needs time. You're not going to rush curing." "I know. I know you know. I'm saying it out loud because knowing it and doing it are different things when you're impatient." She looked at him. "I'm not impatient," she said. "No," he agreed. "You're worried, which is worse." He walked back to his truck, then stopped. "There's a soil testing kit at the school. It's mine, not the school's. I'll bring it the next time I come." He drove away. She stood in the driveway for a moment and looked at the shed. She was not impatient. But mid-September was 9 weeks away, and the first pile was still a pile. The quarter-acre test plot was her father's idea. She had not expected that. It was a Sunday in mid-July, the kind of Louisiana July that settles onto you like a physical presence, and August had walked out to the shed after breakfast slowly with the cane the cardiologist had suggested, and he had mostly been ignoring, and stood in the doorway looking at the 3 piles and the reserve material and the notebook on the window ledge. She was turning the second pile, and she stopped when she heard him. He looked at everything for a long time without speaking. She waited. "First pile's ready?" he asked. "Close. Another week, maybe 2. He was quiet again. She watched him look at the piles, the way he looked at things he was trying to understand, not skeptically, but carefully, with the attention of a man who had spent decades reading fields the way other men read faces. "Sandy ground northeast corner," he said, "near the old equipment path. Hasn't grown anything worth talking about in 3 seasons." "I know it." That'd be a good place to find out. He went back inside. She stood with the pitchfork in her hands for a moment. That was the whole conversation. That was Auguste Fontenot saying, "I see what you're doing, and I think you should try it on real ground, and here's where," which in the economy of her father's speech was an extraordinary amount to say. She finished turning the pile. The first finished compost came out of the bin in the last week of July. Dark, crumbling, sweet-smelling, looking nothing like the black wet bagasse she had started with 4 months ago. She filled a feed bucket with it and carried it to the northeast corner of the property, the tired sandy plot her father had indicated, and worked it into the top 4 inches of soil with a hand fork. She planted sweet corn and pole beans and 3 tomato starts she'd grown from seed on the kitchen windowsill. She watered it in and stood back and looked at it and thought, now we find out. The following 2 weeks were a particular kind of suspense she had not encountered before, not the anxious waiting of bad news coming, but the still alert waiting of something that might be growing. She checked the plot every morning and every evening. The corn germinated on day 6, which was within normal range but felt early. The beans came up on day 8. The tomatoes already started settled in and extended their first true leaves by the 2nd week. She did not allow herself to interpret this yet. Germination proved nothing. What mattered was what happened after. What happened after was August, not the month, her father. He had begun walking further each morning as his recovery progressed. Doctor's orders graded, returned to activity, starting with the yard and extending slowly outward. By early August, he had reached the field paths, moving with the cane and a steadiness that had been returning to him incrementally, like color returning to a landscape after overcast. He walked the northeast plot on a Tuesday morning in the 2nd week of August and stood at its edge for a long time. Sera was in the shed when she heard him on the porch after. Sera. She came to the shed door. He was looking back toward the northeast corner, which was not visible from the porch, but which he had just come from. He had taken his cap off. He was turning it slowly in both hands. "Come look at this with me," he said. They walked out together, him with the cane, her with her hands in her pockets, and stood at the edge of the test plot in the early morning heat. The corn was above knee height. The bean vines had climbed their stakes and were reaching for more. The tomatoes were setting fruit, small and green and numerous, their stems bowing exactly the way the volunteer plant in the dump field had bowed. August stood and looked for a long time. Then he reached down slowly with the careful mechanics of a man whose chest had been opened and repaired 2 weeks earlier, and picked up a small handful of the amended soil from near the base of the corn. He let it fall through his fingers. He watched it fall. Sera watched him. He didn't say anything. He put his cap back on. They walked back to the house, and he held the screen door for her, and she went inside, and neither of them mentioned it at breakfast. But she had seen his face when the soil fell through his fingers. She had seen the thing that moved there. Ward Stelly's truck appeared in the driveway on a Thursday afternoon in the 3rd week of August. Sera saw it from the window of the equipment shed where she was grading material and felt the particular stillness that comes when something you have been half expecting arrives. She watched him get out. He was in a pressed shirt and carried his clipboard, same as always, but there was something different in the way he moved, less of the patient confidence of his previous visits. Something more like a man who has been sent rather than a man who has arrived. He knocked on the house door. Delphine answered. Sera stayed in the shed. She listened to the muffled back and forth of voices, not words, just cadence, and watched through the shed's small window. After 10 minutes, Ward Stelly came back down the porch steps with the particular walk of a man who did not get what he came for. He paused at the bottom of the steps and looked around the property at the fields, at the dump site, beyond the south fence, at the equipment shed. His eyes rested on the shed for a moment. Then he got in his truck and left. She came out of the shed. Delphine was standing on the porch with her arms folded, which was not her worried posture. Her worried posture involved her hands. This was something else. He wanted to discuss the materials on the south lot, Delphine said. The bagasse. He said Pelican had been receiving inquiries from other landowners about the waste, and they were reassessing their disposal situation. Sera processed this. He used the word reassessings twice. Did he know about the compost? I didn't tell him anything. Delphine looked at her. He asked if there had been any unusual activity on the property. I said we've been farming here for 4 generations. I'm not sure what would qualify as unusual. Sera almost smiled. He left a card. Delphine said, I put it on the counter. Sera went inside and looked at the card. Ward Stelly Regional Operations Liaison Pelican Cane Processing. A phone number. On the back, in careful handwriting, interested in speaking with the Fontenote family at their convenience regarding the Southfield material. She put the card back on the counter. Something had shifted, not in her favor yet, not in any way she could name, but in the structure of things. The company that had been treating this ground like a ledger line had driven out to speak to them about it, had used the word reassessing, had left a handwritten note on a business card. She went back to the shed and turned the pile that needed turning, and did not think about it further, because thinking about it further would require her to know what it meant, and she did not know what it meant yet. The bank letter came on a Friday. Not the same letter, a new one in the same window envelope, the same careful language, the same institutional sympathy that managed to sound like neither. The 60-day extension was ending. The outstanding balance on the 28-acre note was due in full within 30 days, or the bank would proceed with the formal process. 30 days. Sera read it at the kitchen table. Her father was resting. Her mother was at work. The kitchen was quiet, except for the ceiling fan and the sound of something moving in the live oak outside the window. 30 days put them at the 3rd week of September. She looked at the window envelope. She looked at the amount. She thought about what she had in the shed, 3 finished piles, now a 4th, curing a test plot that was growing things that would be ready to harvest in October. October, which was after September, after the 3rd week of September, after the bank's 30 days. She had been working towards something that required time, and time was the one thing she did not have. She folded the letter. She did not put it in the junk drawer. She put it in the notebook between the pages where she had written the temperatures of the 3rd pile during its hottest week, the numbers that had felt at the time like proof of something. She went to the shed. She stood in front of the piles, 4 of them now, each at a different stage, the oldest one cured and dark and crumbling, the newest one still in its thermophilic peak, steam rising off it in the August evening heat. She pulled the thermometer from her pocket and pushed it into the newest pile, and it read 152 degrees, which was correct and good and exactly right, and none of it moved the date on the bank letter. She stood with the probe in the pile and felt the full weight of it, not the despair she had felt in the hospital corridor in April which had been shock new and raw, but something colder and more specific, the realization that being right about something was not the same as being in time, that a pile could hit the correct temperature and cure into the correct material, and still be 4 weeks too late for a deadline set by people who had never touched soil with their hands. She had done everything correctly. She had been patient. She had learned and failed and learned and turned and measured and tried again in the dark at 2 in the morning, with no one watching. She had done all of it. And she was going to lose the south field anyway. She pulled the thermometer free. She looked at it. 152 degrees. She put it in her pocket and sat down on the ground with her back against the shed wall and looked at the 4 piles in the evening light and thought, no, not defeat, not acceptance, something that felt in its texture more like recalculation. She had been working one direction, the direction needed to change. She didn't know yet what that meant, but she had 30 days to figure it out. She sat against the shed wall until the light went. Not in defeat. She had been careful these past months about the difference between sitting and surrendering, had learned it the way you learn most useful things, through the experience of confusing them. This was sitting. This was the specific stillness of a mind that has stopped moving in one direction and has not yet found the next. The evening sounds of the bayou came in over the fence line. Frogs first, then the particular trill of the nightjars that nested in the live oaks, then the low, constant presence of the achafalaya doing what it had always done, moving toward the gulf with the patient indifference of something that has never been told it might not make it. She thought about direction. She had been working toward a future moment, compost finished, soil-amended crops, yielding something demonstrated. The bank's timeline assumed none of that mattered, assumed the only relevant fact was the number in the window envelope, and she could not argue with the bank's timeline, could not compost her way around a legal instrument. But Ward Stelly had come back, reassessing, he had said, twice. She turned that word over in the dark, the way you turn a stone to see what's living under it. The company had been paying to dispose of the bagasse truck's drivers the operational cost of hauling waste from the mill to this corner of her family's land. If the bagasse had value, that equation changed. If she could demonstrate that value, not in a test plot, not in a spiral notebook, but in terms a man with a clipboard could carry back to an office, then maybe the direction was not forward toward October. Maybe the direction was sideways toward a conversation that hadn't happened yet. She stood up, went inside, did not look at the notebook, did not look at the bank letter she had folded inside it. She looked at Ward Stelly's business card on the counter for a long time. Then she turned off the kitchen light and went to bed, because there was nothing to do at 10 o'clock at night except sleep, and she needed to be clear-headed for what came next. She called Emmett Burris on Saturday morning, not to ask permission, not for reassurance. She called because he had information she didn't have. Specifically, he had been inside a room with Pelican Cane Processing once before, had understood what that room required, and had learned, at some cost, what it punished. She needed to know the difference before she walked in. He listened to what she told him, the bank letter, Ward Stelly's visit, the timeline. Silence for a moment on the line. How much finished material do you have? 1 full pile, cured 4th pile close. Enough to amend about 3/4 of an acre properly. Test plot results. Corn is ready to pull. Beans overgrew the stakes twice. Tomatoes are heavy, more than anything we've grown in that field in years. I have the soil kit. I was going to come next week. I need you to come today. Another silence. Not reluctance, she had learned to read his silences, and this one was calculation. I'll be there at 2, he said. He arrived at 1:40. He ran the soil tests without ceremony core samples, from the test plot, from the adjacent untreated ground, from the edge of the old dump site, from the center of the first finished compost pile. He worked with the focused efficiency of someone who has done this so many times that the procedure has become transparent, invisible, leaving only the data. Sera watched and said nothing, and handed him what he asked for when he asked for it. He took the samples back to his truck and ran the analysis with the portable kit recording numbers in his own notebook in the cramped handwriting of a man who had been taking notes for 40 years. When he was done, he sat in the open door of his truck with the notebook on his knee and looked at the numbers for a while. Organic matter in the test plot, he said finally, is running at 3 times the untreated adjacent soil. Microbial activity. He stopped, looked at the number again as if confirming it, is the highest I have measured in 23 years of doing this. Nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium are all elevated. The compost itself is testing as a complete amendment everything a commercial organic fertilizer would list on its label, plus the biology. Sera sat on the tailgate and listened. What you're producing, he said, and his voice had shifted slightly, something careful in it. The tone of a man choosing words that are also true is worth money, not as a curiosity, as a product. She had known this in the way she had known a lot of things before she knew how to say them. I need to show that to someone with a clipboard before the 3rd week of September, she said. Emmett looked at her. Pelican's operations manager isn't Stelly, he said. Stelly is a liaison. The person who would make a decision about the Southfield material is a man named Raymond Doucet. He's been with the company 12 years. He's an agronomist by training. A pause. He knows what these numbers mean. She processed this. How do you know that? Because I know what Raymond Doucet studied and where, and because I have spent 20 years paying attention to that company. He said it without bitterness, which was the most informative way he could have said it. I'm telling you, don't send Stelly a phone call. Ask for Doucet. Use the test results. Use your own words. He handed her the notebook open to the page with the soil numbers. Not as ammunition, he said, as information. There's a difference. I learned that too late. She called the Pelican cane processing offices on Monday morning from the kitchen with the notebook open on the table and the bank letter beside it and the thermometer in her pocket because she had taken to carrying it the way other people carry small talismans, not superstitiously, but because the weight of it in her hand had come to mean something she couldn't fully articulate. She asked for Raymond Doucet. She was transferred twice. She was put on hold for 4 minutes. Then a voice, unhurried slightly, Louisiana, accented the voice of a man who answered his own phone, said, Doucet. She told him who she was. She told him about the Southfield and the test results and what she had been doing for the past 4 months. She used the carbon-to-nitrogen ratio. She used the words thermophilic and microbial activity and complete organic amendment, not to impress, but because they were accurate and because she had learned them in a library, at a corner table, and they were hers now. She told him what Emmett's soil kit had found. She spoke for 6 minutes without stopping. When she finished, Doucet was quiet for a moment. How old are you? He asked. 17. Another pause. Who taught you the C to N ratio? A book from 1947, and a librarian who rescued extension pamphlets from the recycling bin. Something shifted in the quality of his silence, not amusement, something more serious than that. "I'd like to see the test results," he said, "and the plot." "I'd like you to see them too," she said. "My family has a bank deadline in 26 days. I want to be honest with you about that." "I appreciate that," he said, and she believed him. "I'll be there Thursday." Raymond Doucet arrived on Thursday in a truck without a company logo, which she noticed and did not comment on. He was in his early 50s, compact, with the hands of someone who had spent time in fields and the eyes of someone who had spent time in offices and had not entirely resolved the two. He shook her hand. He shook her father's hand. August had insisted on being present, had dressed carefully, for it had said nothing about this to anyone, but had come down the porch steps with the cane and a deliberateness that said, "I am the owner of this land, and I am here." They went to the shed first. Sera walked him through the piles, all four each, at its different stage, the way she would have walked him through a classroom, explaining the process, the material sources, the turning intervals, the temperature she had recorded week by week. She showed him the notebook. She showed him the cured first pile, let him run it through his fingers, watched his face as he registered the texture and the smell, the dark, crumbling forest floor richness of a process completed correctly. He asked good questions. She answered them without hedging. Then they walked the test plot. He stood at its edge for a while. The corn was ready, fully tasseled, heavy-eared, standing waist-high in ground that had grown nothing meaningful in 3 seasons. The bean vines had claimed their stakes and were working on the fence wire beside them. The tomatoes were the same dark-leaved, heavy-stemmed abundance she had first seen in the volunteer plant in the dump field, the plant that had started all of this. Doucet crouched down and pressed 2 fingers into the soil near the base of a cornstalk. He held his fingers there for a moment, then he pulled them out and looked at the dark soil clinging to them. "You did this in 4 months," he said. "The biology did it. I just gave it the right conditions." He stood up, he looked at the piles, he looked at the dump site beyond the south fence, the old section, the newer sections, the accumulated 7 years of material his company had been paying to put there. "We spent $60,000 a year on bagasse disposal," he said. Not to her, to himself, almost. Then he looked at her. "What you're describing is a processing partnership. We provide the material, your operation converts it, we buy back the finished amendment for our contracted farmland program." She had not used those words. He had arrived at them himself, which was better. "That's one way to describe it," she said. "What would you add?" "Remediation cost for the south field and the medical bills." She said it steadily without apology. "The land damage is documented. The numbers are in the notebook." He looked at August, who was standing at the edge of the plot with his cane and his cap and his expression of complete calm. August said nothing. He didn't need to. "I'll need to take this to our board," Doucet said. "I want to be honest with you, that's a 2 to 3 week process. I have 26 days. Then I'll take it to our board in the next 48 hours. He left without the clipboard. She hadn't seen him carrying it, she realized. He had come without it. The call came on the following Tuesday. She was at school in the agricultural classroom, which she recognized as either coincidence or the universe's modest sense of narrative, depending on how you felt about such things. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She looked at the screen. She asked Mr. Burras if she could step out. She stood in the hallway outside the classroom door and answered. Doucet's voice, "We've agreed to the framework. remediation of the south field at our cost, a contribution toward the medical expenses. I want to be clear, it's not an admission of anything, it's a goodwill gesture, and you should have someone look at the language before you sign. A pause. And we'd like to begin a formal purchasing arrangement for finished compost from your operation, starting with the next completed batch. The hallway was empty, fluorescent lights, the distant sound of a class in session, somewhere a teacher's voice, the scrape of chairs. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," he said. "You did the work, I just recognized it." She went back into the classroom. Emmett Burris looked up from the whiteboard. She sat down at her desk. She opened her notebook. She wrote the date and the temperature she had recorded that morning, 108 degrees in the fourth pile, curing now moving through its last active phase into the quiet of completion. She did not say anything. He did not ask. But she saw him from the corner of her eye turn back to the whiteboard with something in his posture that had not been there before, a particular quality of stillness, the stillness of a man who has just put down something heavy. The south field took time. This was the part that did not resolve neatly, the part that was not in any agreement. Doucet's team began remediation in October, removing the active dump material, grading the ground, beginning the long work of rebuilding what 7 years had depleted. The banknote was retired in September, 2 days before the deadline from the remediation payment and the first purchasing installment combined. August signed the papers at the kitchen table, with the percolator making its sounds in the background, and Delphine sitting beside him, with her hands folded on the table the way she sat when she was not going to cry. The bottom land, the good bottom her grandfather's ground, needed more than one season. It needed what all damaged things need, consistent attention, given without guarantee of quick return. Sera worked it. Season by season, she expanded her windrows behind the shed. She taught herself new things. She made mistakes and corrected them, and wrote the corrections in new notebooks that accumulated on the shed's window ledge in a row that grew slowly, year by year, like a record of something. Clovis Thibodeau began composting his own grass clippings in the fall without comment. He used a method she recognized from watching him, her method adjusted for his particular stubbornness, which manifested in using a slightly different turning interval that she had opinions about and kept to herself. He asked her questions sometimes over the fence in the oblique way of a man who does not ask questions. She answered in the direct way of a girl who does not find this oblique. Emmett Burris came by twice a year with the soil testing kit. He ran the numbers. He wrote them in his own notebook. Once, looking at the test results from the good bottom, the ground that was slowly measurably returning to itself, he said, "In 23 years, I have never watched soil improve this fast." "It's not fast," she said. "No," he agreed, "for soil it is." The morning she decided to test the bottom land itself, not the test plot near the house, not the amended corners, but the lowest part of the good bottom. The ground that had been under the worst of it was a morning in early April, the spring she turned 19. Cool. The kind of Louisiana morning that holds the night's moisture in the air like a breath held too long, the kind that makes the bayou smell ancient and particular, makes you understand why people have been living beside this water for as long as they have. She walked down to the south field alone. Her father was at the kitchen table with his coffee. Her mother was getting ready for work. The farm was quiet in the early light, the herons already working the edges of the drainage ditch, the barn swallows beginning their low arcs over the pasture. She reached the bottomland, the old fence line where she had stood 8 years old, and then 10, and then 17, watching the trucks back up to the good ground and leave their loads. The trucks had not come in 2 years. The ground showed it slowly, not dramatically, the way good things show themselves. She pulled the thermometer from her pocket. The same thermometer. The dial face was scratched now, the grip worn smooth. Where her thumb rested, the steel of the probe darkened from years of use. She had replaced the battery once. She had cleaned it with a cloth so many times that the cloth itself was stained a permanent earth brown. She crouched down at the edge of the good bottom, the lowest corner, the worst corner, the corner that had taken the weight of it for the longest time, and she pushed the probe into the soil. Not into a compost pile, into the ground itself. She left it for 2 minutes. The way the light was coming in over the live oaks to the east, long and golden and low, it landed on the thermometer's dial at an angle that made the needle easy to read. She looked at the number. 61 degrees. She sat back on her heels and looked at it. 61 degrees was not the temperature of living compost. It was not the thundering heat of thermophilic bacteria doing their fast, furious work. It was the temperature of soil that was warming with the April morning soil that was alive in the quiet, steady way that ground is alive when it is doing what ground does, holding water, feeding roots, cycling nutrients through the invisible web of organisms that make agriculture possible at all. It was the temperature of ordinary healthy soil, which was extraordinary. She pulled the probe free, wiped it on her jeans, as she always did. The soil it brought up on the tip was darker than the surrounding ground had been 2 years ago, darker than the test plot had been when she first amended it, dark in the particular way that meant organic matter, that meant life accumulated and held. She held the thermometer in both hands for a moment. The birds were in full voice now. Somewhere behind her, across the field, she could hear the sound of the bayou moving, the low, constant, unhurried sound of water, going where it has always been going, carrying what it has always been carrying, patient with everything in its path. The morning smelled like April in Louisiana, like wet earth and blooming things and the particular sweetness of the achafalaya waking up. It did not smell like the trucks. It had not smelled like the trucks for 2 years, and she had stopped noticing the absence, which was how you knew the absence had become the truth. She stood up. She put the thermometer back in her pocket. She looked at the good bottom, at the ground her grandfather had said you could push a fence post into by hand, the ground her father had touched with his fingers and not needed to speak about the ground that had been damaged and had not known how to fix itself until someone gave it what it needed. She didn't stay long. There was work to do. There was always work to do, and she had stopped feeling this as a burden somewhere in the last 2 years, had come to understand it as the simple fact of living in relationship with a piece of the earth. You work it. It works you. The conversation goes both ways. She walked back up toward the house in the early light, the thermometer in her pocket, the probe still warm from the ground. Behind her, the good bottom settled into the morning. Something was growing in it. It always had been. If there's a piece of land in your life, a farm, a yard, a garden, a single pot on a windowsill, or someone who taught you that broken things can be rebuilt with patience, leave a comment and tell us about them. The people who build things quietly, without asking for recognition, deserve to be remembered out loud.